Mental illness and hatred pulls the trigger, not the gun.
In condemning this weekend's senseless tragedies, President Trump blamed, quote, mentally ill monsters.
Another twisted monster opened fire.
What's the variable? It's really
mental health experts are pushing back against the link between mental illness and gun violence. Data shows the overwhelming majority of people with mental illness are not violent, and they're far more likely to be victims than perpetrators. A 2015 study found about 1 in 5 mass killers may have a mental illness. And similarly, a 2018 FBI report found 25% of shooters had been diagnosed with mental illness. But a recent Secret Service report on mass public attacks did find 2/3 of attackers in the study showed signs of mental health issues. Experts I talked to say mental health and illness are not synonymous.
In other words, people can have challenges with their mental health but not have an illness. And that really is that group of people who appear to have revenge fantasies, who might have very narcissistic personalities that view the world based on their own experience and have trouble empathizing or understanding what somebody else's experience might be.
And Morgan, there isn't just one explanation for violence on this scale.
No, there's not. Experts we talk to say there's a lot of complex, complicated factors that lead to this, different pathways in people's lives. But experts do say social isolation is a common key factor they find in these cases.
So what did the psychiatrist that you spoke with say about the reaction linking these mass shootings to mental illness?
Well, he said, number one, that's a dangerous road to go down. He says the rhetoric isn't accurate and oversimplifies mental illness and its role in mass shootings while amplifying the stigma.
There's the risk of, because we don't understand the problem fully, that we come up with a solution that is inadequate, and people who do have mental illness associated with this horrific notion of mass shootings will then be less likely to seek care or identify that they have a mental illness themselves. The stigma of that diminishes a person's willingness to openly talk about their own health condition.
I also talked to a criminologist who's researched and written about mass shootings and hate crimes. Dr. Randy Blazak says we're ignoring gender in this conversation. He says we tend to blame mental illness, especially if the shooters are white men.
It's a complex issue. We're always looking sort of for one solution to it. And kind of different types of shootings have different motivating factors. The shooting in Ohio is different than the shooting in Texas because there are sort of different conditions that lead up to it. But there is this sort of hyper masculine obsession with violence as a problem-solving mechanism, gun violence especially.
Did the people you talked to talk about any solutions?
Yeah, and I'm glad they did. The psychiatrist I spoke to said we need to be doing these two things, right? One, building a society that doesn't produce this. In early childhood, in school, teach kids and teens to regulate their emotions, form relationships, hold jobs, and maintain a sense of right and wrong even under stress. Two, of course, the national conversation, fix the quick and easy access to firearms. Studies show a country's rate of gun ownership is a better predictor of mass shootings than mental illnesses.
Thank you for taking a deeper look into this issue because we keep hearing about it.
Right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Laurel.